Today we're going to take a close look at supply and demand and look at their corresponding graphs. First, we'll look at demand. What is demand? Well, demand is the amount of product that consumers are willing and able to purchase at a series of different prices. When drawing a demand graph, it is important to correctly label the axes. The y-axis is always labeled price, and the x-axis labeled quantity. A tip to remember this is that the P runs vertical, just like the y-axis. Remember, the demand curve is downward sloping. There are two different ways that price and quantity can change along a demand curve. This can be a shift along the curve or a complete shift left or right of the curve. A shift along the demand curve, as shown in this graph, is due to the change in quantity demanded, or a change in price. So what makes the demand curve shift? One way is because of consumer preferences. Some consumers just prefer apples over oranges, or oranges over bananas. Another way is the number of buyers in the market changes. In the last 15 years, the amount of customers purchasing CD players have decreased, and the amount of people buying iPods have increased. Another way demand can change is a change in consumer incomes. After a student graduates college and receives their first job, they can lay off the ramen noodles and pick up some steaks with their change in income. The final way demand can change is through consumer expectations. If consumers expect gas prices to go up before a holiday weekend, they may purchase it ahead of time, thus increasing demand. An increase in demand is represented by a shift to the right of the curve. For example, if consumers purchase the latest Apple products, their demand will increase. A decrease in demand is represented by a shift left of the curve. For example, less people will buy the iPhone 5 when the iPhone 6 is unveiled. Now let's take a look at supply. Supply shows the various amounts of a product that producers are willing and able to make for sale. Once again, price is located on the y-axis and quantity on the x. Supply is upward sloping. So what exactly makes the supply curve shift left or right? One way is through a change in resource prices. If the price of steel increases for a car manufacturer, they will have to decrease the production of cars. A second way is if there is a change in technology. An example of this is when Henry Ford introduced the idea of the assembly line. It increased production, thus decreasing the price of cars. Taxes and subsidies is another way through which supply can change. If the government taxes a business, they may pass this on to the consumers in the form of higher prices, as shown in this graph. Producer expectations can also change the supply. If a farmer expects higher wheat prices in the future, he will hold his harvest from the market to make more money. The final way in which supply can change is through the number of sellers in a market. The larger number of suppliers in the market, the more the supply curve will shift to the right. A shift to the right in the supply curve is an increase in supply. For example, if a new supplier enters the market, there will be an increase in supply. A shift left in the curve is a decrease in supply. An example of this is if the government taxes a business, decreasing their supply. Now that we have looked at both supply and demand, we can look at what equilibrium is. Equilibrium is where supply and demand are equal, or where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. When looking at a supply and demand graph, anything above equilibrium is surplus, or excess supply, and anything below that is shortage, or excess demand. So how exactly are price and quantity affected in an equilibrium graph? Let's pretend this graph represents an auto manufacturer at its current price and quantity. If the government subsidizes the auto manufacturer, their supply will increase, shifting the supply curve to the right. This results in a decrease in the price and an increase in the quantity. Congratulations, you have just learned about supply and demand, their corresponding graphs, and how the price and quantity are affected in their equilibrium.